Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and today's show is once again on Robert E. Lee, and this is where he becomes a U.S. cavalry soldier and takes part in the Second Cavalry, um, and also in the Comanche raids to protect the pioneers and the people living out on the plains from the Comanche Indian tribes attacking them. And again, we're taking it from his nephew's book, Fitzhugh Lee, a biography of Robert E. Lee. And it is linked on the show page to get you a copy. We don't promote it. I mean, it's a good book. And if you want a copy, we can go there and go to the link and get one. And again, Brother Alexis will be hosting the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV to learn about this famous U.S. general. And we had discussed his early life and how he got to West Point. And now we'll see how he, what he did before the Civil War breaks out. So we had left him at West Point, and after the treaty with Mexico, what happened? So there was a war with Mexico in 1848, and that's where we left off last time. And so what does Lee do?
Yeah. He says her victory is no less than war. A treaty was ratified between the United States and Mexico, which was received with joy by the inhabitants of both countries and was most heartily welcomed by the Americans in Mexico. Captain Lee was once more at home, bearing with him the plaudits of the army and high appreciation of its commander. He wrote from Arlington, June 30th, 1848, to his brother of the Navy. Here I am once again, my dear Smith, perfectly surrounded by Mary and her precious children, who seem to devote themselves to staring at the furrows in my face and the white hairs in my head. It is not surprising that I am hardly recognizable to some of the young eyes around me, and perfectly unknown to the youngest. But some of the older ones gaze with astonishment and wonder at me, and seem at a loss to reconcile what they see and what was pictured in their imaginations. I find them too much grown and all well. I have much cause for thankfulness and gratitude to that good God who has once more united us. I was greeted on my arrival by your kind letter, which was the next thing to seeing you in person. I wish I could say when I shall be able to visit you, but I as yet know nothing of the intention of the department concerning me. I cannot now tell what my movements will be. Mary has recently returned from a visit to poor Anne and gives a pitiable account of her distress. You may have heard of her having hurt her left hand. She is now consequently without the use of either, and cannot even feed herself. She has suffered so much that it is not wonderful her spirit should be depressed. She sent many injunctions that I must come to her before even unpacking my trunk. And I think of running over there for a day after the 4th of July, if practicable. You say I must let you know when I am ready to receive visits. Now, have you any desire to see the celebration, etc., the 4th of July? Bring Sis, Nanny, and the little ones. I long to see you all. I only arrived yesterday after a long journey up the Mississippi, which route I was induced to take for the better accommodations of my horse, and I wish to spare her as much annoyance and fatigue as possible. She already having undergone so much suffering in my service, I landed her at Wheeling and left her to come over with Jim. I have seen but a few of our friends as yet, but I hear they are all well. Cousin Anna is at Ravensworth. I met Mrs. John Mason yesterday as I passed through W. All her people are well. I hear that pretty rat hearing of my arrival ran off yesterday evening to take refuge with you. Never mind, there's another person coming from Mexico, from whom she cannot hide herself. Tell her with my regrets that I brought Mucus Coccus from her young rifleman, who is as bright and handsome as ever. No, Sis Nanny, your sister was not here when I arrived. Are you satisfied? She had gone to Alexandria to learn the news and do a little shopping. But have but I- but but I have laid violent hands on her now. An opportunity has just offered to the post office, and I have scribbled off this to assure you of my love and remembrance. With much love to Sis Nanny and the children. Kind regards to Mr. R. and Mrs. V. and C. I remain affectionately your brother, R. E. Lee.
So we see from this personal letter, kind of sets the stage of this phase of his life. He doesn't know what's out for him. Point out for those who aren't so aware what was going on in the 19th century, coming back from Mexico with his horse, he could have traveled by sea or by land, or he could have gone by river, and he chose river, and he came up the Mississippi and then up the Ohio to Wheeling, where he personally would have boarded the Baltimore and Ohio Railway and had to leave probably his horse until they could find a stable car to bring it along to. So that's why he talks about trying to spare his horse fatigue by coming up an easier route. So, and you see he was a very family man, and very much, as soon as he arrived home to write out a long letter. Most people the day they arrived wouldn't do that, but the letters were the only way of communicating back then. So why does Lee end up leaving West Point to become an officer in the U.S. Cavalry now that the Mexican-American War has come to an end?
Well, he was hired to be commandant or headmaster or principal, one of the words he used back then, to watch over everything, the student life, the drills, pretty much what a principal does at a normal school. Well, as we told you about the show on West Point, Lee said it was this snake bed, and so he leaves that, and it says his term of office at West Point was terminated by his assignment to the cavalry, the great civilizing arms of the United States had been extended so as to embrace large extents of territory, and more cavalry was required. An expenditure of $160 million, 30 victories in Mexico, and the capture of tenfold places, including the capital city of the enemy, resulted in adding the Republic of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. The increase in population made it necessary to increase the army in order to give full protection to all citizens within the new boundary lines. After the United States had secured independence, cavalry was not at first recognized as a component part of the regular army. The first mounted regiment, called the 1st Dragoons, was not organized until 1833, then followed the 2nd Dragoons in 1836. And in 1846, another regiment was added, designated the Mounted Riflemen. With a vast extent of territory and population of whites numbering about 20 million in 1855, the cavalry arm of service consisted of but 3 regiments. General Scott, in his report of the operations of the Army for 1853, first urged that the Army must be increased by 2 regiments of dragoons and 2 regiments of infantry. The following year, Honorable Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, renewed the Commander-in-Chief's recommendation, and President Pierce asked its favorable consideration by Congress, stating that the Army was an estimable importance as a nucleus around which the volunteer force of the nation could promptly gather in the hour of danger, and that he thought it was wise to maintain a military peace establishment. Mr. R.M.T. Hunter, at the time a distinguished senator in Congress from the state of Virginia, offered an amendment to the Army Appropriation Bill, which had passed the House in 1854, authorizing the increase of the Army by 2 regiments of cavalry and 500 mounted volunteers, who were to serve for 12 months. James Shields, an Irishman by birth, who had served conspicuously in the Mexican War as a brigadier general, and who was then a senator from the state of Illinois, offered a substitute to Hunter's amendment, embodying the views of his former commander-in-chief, Scott. A protracted debate resulted. Sam Houston of Texas and Thomas H. Benton of Missouri led the opposition to the measure, the former saying that in Texas Republic, before annexation to the United States, the expenses of the Indian War had not exceeded $10,000 a year, and that the settlers had better protection against hostile tribes of Indians than they had received from the regiments of the regular army, while the latter indulged in a tirade of abuse against the army generally, calling them schoolhouse officers and pothouse soldiers. But he did not believe the aim of the administration was to relieve the frontier settlements, but to furnish places of graduates of West Point and the friends of Secretary of War, saying that the object of Mr. Pierce and Jefferson Davis was the ultimate conquest of the island of Cuba.
So the U.S. Army gets 2 new regiments of cavalry by this rather long procedure of time. And so Lee joins up, and who else joins with Lee in the U.S. cavalry?
Also, names you might hear recognize from the Confederate Army. Sumner, Sedgwick, McClellan, Emory, Thomas, Stoneman, Stanley, Carr, who served with much distinction on the Union side of the war from 1861 to 1865, as well as Albert, Sidney, Johnston, Joseph E. Johnston, Lee, Hardee, Kirby Smith, Field, Hood, Jeb Stuart, and a number of others.
That's a good portion of the command of the South during the Civil War. No wonder they had such expert cavalry officers. Was it hard for Lee to switch from being an engineer to serving in the cavalry?
Yeah, after all that time, after learning the trade of an engineer, he's like, I gotta go back to school. So I had to relearn how to ride his horse, even though he rode it in Mexico, and do all the maneuvers with the reins. And so, yeah. Yeah. So, this is what it says. Brevet Colonel Lee left the Engineer Corps with great regret. He had thoroughly mastered its scientific details with a national reputation, stood in front rank of military engineers. At West Point, he had been instructed in cavalry, artillery, infantry tactics, and like all cadets, at the date of graduation was supposed to be equally informed as to the drill and duties of each arm of service. For 26 years had rolled around since graduation, during which his attention had been entirely absorbed in the profession of engineer. and it was necessary that he should again study cavalry tactics. Promotion was slow in the United States Army in a long official life. He had only reached the lineal rank of captain. By sudden transition in a single bound, he had been promoted to a lieutenant colonel, a position he probably wouldn't have reached in an ordinary course of promotion. For many years, his duty to all concerned demanded that he should accept the promotion, should accept the position. It was an unwritten law in the army that if promotion was offered and declined, the reputation of the officer suffered. It was regarded as a confession on his part that he had not capacity to perform the duties of a higher grade. Next to the engineer, the cavalry service was the most agreeable to Lee. He was fond of horses, liked to see them clean, fed, well taken care of. He had a firm seat in the saddle, rode gracefully and well. He might never become, in the language of the cavalry song, a bold dragoon, who scorns all care, as he stalks around with his uncropped hair.
Okay, so what more do we know about him before we follow his life out in the 2nd Cavalry that you can add, or you might want to add, AJ?
Let's see here. Lee was endowed with youth, health, strength, and talents for war. He'd been shaken well into the saddle by his Mexican campaign, and buoyant and brave and fearless and graceful rider. He could have maneuvered squadrons, and when the bugle sounded the charge, the reins loosened and a saber flashed in the air led them to victory. The headquarters of the 2nd Cavalry was established at Louisville, Kentucky. Lieutenant Colonel Lee assumed command on the 20th of April, 1855. Afterward, he was transferred to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, where the companies were to be organized and instructed, which was the temporary regimental headquarters. He writes, Mrs. Lee from the Post, July 1st, 1855. The chaplain of the Post of Mr. Fish is now absent, is an Episcopal clergyman, and well spoken of. We have therefore not had service since I have been here. The church stands out in the trees and grotesque in its form and ancient in its appearance. I have not been in it, but am content to read the Bible and prayers alone, and draw much comfort from their holy precepts and merciful promises. Though feeling unable to follow the one and truly unworthy of the other, I must still pray to the glorious God without whom there is no help, and with whom there is no danger, that he may guard and protect you all, and more than supply to you my absence, is my daily and constant prayer. I have been busy all week superintending and drilling recruits. Not a stitch of clothing has yet to arrive for them, though I made the necessary requisition for it to be sent here more than 2 months ago in Louisville. Yesterday, a muster, I found one of the late arrivals in a dirty, tattered shirt and pants, with a white hat and shoes, with other garments to match. I asked him why he did not put on clean clothes. He said he had none. I asked him if he could not wash and mend those. He said he had nothing else to put on. I then told him immediately after muster to go down to the river, wash his clothes, and sit on the bank and watch the passing steamboats till they dried, and then mend them. This morning at inspection he looked as proud as possible, stood in the position of a soldier with the little fingers on the seams of his pants, his beaver cocked back, his toes sticking through his shoes, but his skin and solitary 2 garments clean. He grinned very happily at my compliments. I have got a fine plus, which was left me by Colonel Sumner. He was educated by his daughter, Mrs. Jenkins, but is too fond of getting up on my lap and on my bed. He followed me all about the house and stands at the door in an attitude of defiance at all passing dogs. In November following he was in Kansas, having been temporarily detached from his regiment and detailed to serve as a member of court-martial ordered to convene to try an assistant surgeon of the army for leaving a station in the midst of a fatal epidemic, and wrote Mrs. Lee from Fort Riley, November 5th, 1855. The court progresses slowly. A good deal was told in the evidence of Saturday. Mrs. Wood's wife, of Brevet Major Woods, 6th Infantry, whose husband had left on the Sioux expedition, was taken ill at 9 p.m. on the 2nd of August. Her younger child, a boy of 3, was taken that night at 12, and about 6 next morning her eldest, a girl of 5 years. The mother then, when told that her end was approaching, asked her only attendant, a niece of the chaplain, to take down the last request to her children and absent husband. The sickness of her children had kindly been concealed from her by this young lady, who managed by the aid of a soldier to attend to them all. They all died that morning, the 3rd of August. The boy preceded and the girl followed, the mother by about an hour. Their bodies rest in the same grave. I pray their spirits may be united in heaven. The husband, stripped of all he loved, is still absent. In the same day, Major Ogden, Mrs. Wood's nurse, a soldier and wife, died, making 7 corpses in the house in one day. Major Ogden was a valuable soldier and much beloved by his men. They have erected to his memory on an adjacent hill overlooking the fort in the beautiful valley of the Kansas, and its branches a stone monument in their own design and workmanship. The epitaph on it relates in touching simplicity. His services in death, he died as he lived, a soldier and a Christian. He repeated the Lord's Prayer with his last breath. There were 59 deaths during the epidemic. Mrs. Armstead, wife of Major Armstead, General Louis Armstead, killed at Gettysburg, died in 6 hours after she was taken. Her husband had marched with his company, but only proceeded 30 miles when overtaken by an express. He returned in the night, found his wife dead, and after her funeral in the morning, the same fatal 3rd of August, started for his camp, carrying his 2 little children with him. A soldier has a hard life, but little consideration.
The outposts on the Great Plains in the 1850s suffered a lot from cholera outbreaks, very deadly disease. There was no known cure back then. So that tells a lot about Lee, how he relates this to his family. Probably doesn't give them much confidence of seeing him again. So who was the commander of the 2nd Cavalry, and what was their mission on the Great Plains?
The 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Johnson, on the 27th of October, began its long march from Jefferson Barracks to western Texas. It numbered 750 men and 800 horses. It marched under the command of its colonel, Major Hardy being the only other field officer who could accompany it, Lee and Thomas being on court-martial detail. The regiment was destined for the next few years to be stationed at the various posts of western Texas, and its duty was to protect the scalp of the settler from the tomahawk of the savage. Texas has an area of 274,000 square miles, or 150 million acres of land. It is 2.5 times the area of Great Britain and Ireland. In order to watch over such a stretch of frontier, it was necessary to divide the regiment up so that only a few companies occupied the same post.
Okay, so we see the vast area over which the Second Cavalry had to protect everyone, and it was Western Texas where the Comanche Indians lived, and during the Civil War, they pretty much went riot. But at this point in U.S. history, the settlers were moving ever further west and encroaching on their lands and the buffalo herds, and this was causing a lot of conflict. So, how soon after taking command did it happen that Lee's own father-in-law passed away? Oh, so excuse me. I'll save that question for a moment. How was the mail the family soldiers moved, and who invented the tent still used in this day? Let's do that first, and then we'll get to his father-in-law.
Yeah. United States mail was carried by armed soldiers on small mules, whose habitual habitual gait was a gallop, while officers and their families were transported in ambulances drawn by mules and accompanied by armed escorts. At the end of each day's journey, the night was spent in tents. Sibley of the Second Dragoons, when traveling in May in way with his wife and daughter over Texas prairies, first conceived of the idea of a famous tent called after him. He was caught in a norther and made a fire in his wall tent during the night, hoping the smoke would go out the opening in front. It did not do so. The next day he worked at the model of the tent in a shape similar to the Indian teepee. The present Army Sibley tent is the result. So we've seen all these hunting lodge tents with a spot for the fire to go out of, and it has the opening for the stove sits.
So he was the inventor of that tent. He was of the Second Cavalry. So now this little tragedy hits the family. His father-in-law passes away after he gets out on the plains and starts serving in the Second Cavalry.
Yeah. It was about that. It was on that same day, so he had to return home to Virginia to settle the state of Mr. Cuttis. I believe if it's right, Cuttis I think great grandson of George Washington.
I guess he had to settle the estate since he was named the executor.
Yeah. And also what happens on the very same day, James Brown starts the Harper Ferry raid.
Okay. So so this is what happens while he's on it, leaving home. There's Harper Ferry Brown, and people don't know James Brown was a famous abolitionist. He was, well, I think he was a minister. He let his beard grow big. He was an ardent preacher of the freeing of the slaves. He felt that this was a sign of the end times, and the freeing of the slaves was an absolute historical necessity, and that all Christians should be obliged to it. He agreed on the freeing of the slaves. He held the Catholic position that racial slavery was completely immoral and totally unjustified and intolerable. He advocated the use of force to free slaves, people who are unjust. And I would say that's not far from the Catholic position either, although I don't know anyone in Catholic history actually advocating using force to free slaves rather than legislating their freedom. So that's who John Brown was, and the Harper's Ferry. So maybe you can tell us something more about John Brown and why he raided Harper's Ferry and what this led to.
Yeah. October 16th, 1859, on that same Sunday afternoon, when Colonel Lee was at home and settling the estate when John Brown, with a small force, marched into Harper's Ferry with the avowed purpose of liberating slaves and inaugurating war between the whites and blacks. Colonel Lee was enjoying the hospitality of his Arlington home, having asked for furlough in a long career to settle up to the state of Mr. Custis, being his sole executor. It was in range of the Secretary of War when the officer decided to take prompt measure to regain the United States arsenal, which Brown had captured. No one then knew the limits of the aggressive action of Brown. An officer well equipped by experience, courage, and balanced judgment was required to represent the government. The needle in the Secretary of War's office turned by mere force of instinct to Lee, and he promptly responded to the summons. A battalion of Marines from the Navy Yard at Washington was ordered to be put at his service. And the troops of the regular army at Fort Monroe. The John Brown raid, as it was termed, was the natural outgrowth of the agitation by the abolitionists of the slavery question on the mind of the wild fanatic.
Fanatic. Yeah, that's one sentence. There's 3 hard words in it.
The mad actor in the Harper's Ferry tragedy was born in the state of Kentucky, and for a greater part of 59 years had been a monomaniac.
A monomaniac. That means he fixates on one idea and goes after it without thinking of anything else.
On the subject of freedom of the Negro. His mind had become overexcited, and his frenzy, he already performed deeds which placed him close to the dangling rope. At Springfield, Mass., where he once resided, he formed an order called the League of Gileadites. Okay. Pledged to rescue fugitive slaves. To this order he delivered addresses in manuscript, saying in one of them, "Stand by one another, and by your friend while a drop of blood remains, and by hanging, if you must." 9 years afterwards in Virginia, the rope was placed in an uncomfortable proximity to his own neck. Kansas won a territory, and an applicant for admission to the American Union was made. The abolition battlefield. John Brown went there, of course, for agitation was the business of life. Acts of violence frequent. Excitement in the territory grew and finally culminated in the Potawatomi massacre, where 5 unoffending citizens were called from their beds and assassinated by Brown and his companions. The commotion created by the carnage increased by the notoriety of the butcher, and he was an abolition hero. Eastern agitators placed on his head the crown of heroism, and offers of arms and money were freely tendered. His fanaticism grew, and his zeal knew no proper bounds. Virginia was selected as the best point to carry out his plans. There he would incite the Negroes to rebellion and furnish them with arms from the United States arsenal. In his madness, he pictured a great growing army of black recruits from all portions of the Southern Army.
Yeah, so John Brown wasn't much different from Black Lives Matter, an organization run by whites out to incite blacks to violence. Though John Brown felt that violence was the only way to liberate them from slavery. He didn't consider legislation, probably because he had lost faith in what was going on in Congress. But he was supported by lots of individuals who didn't care what kind of crimes he committed, and he was involved in murder, homicide in Kansas. That's documented. So this is not a lily white activist. This guy was deeply involved in what would be called in those days, if they had the term, terrorism. And however, the text we just read was written by the nephew of Robert E. Lee. So calling him a monomaniac might be a bit much there. But it's kind of ironic now that when the Northern abolitionist comes across the border to attack Virginia for the purpose of basically starting a civil war, you have Lee on the other side there, armed with U.S. Marines of the United States Army that end up capturing this Northern abolitionist. It's kind of ironic that this should be the case. But let's read the letters of Colonel Lee at Harper's Ferry that tell us what happened in this, one of the most important events that sparked the Civil War.
Lieutenant Colonel Lee from Harper's Ferry, December 1st, 1859. I arrived here yesterday about noon with 4 companies from Fort Monroe and was busy all evening getting accommodations for the men and posting pickets to ensure timely notice of the approach of the enemy. The feelings of the community seem to have calmed down. I have been received with every kindness. I presumed we are fixed here until after the 16th. Tomorrow we will probably see the last of Captain Brown, old John Brown. There will be less interest for the others, but I still think the troops will not be withdrawn till they are similarly disposed of. This morning I was introduced to Mrs. Brown, who with Mr. Tyndall and Mrs. Mickham, all from Philadelphia, has come to have a last interview with her husband. As it is a matter over which I have no control, and wish to take none, I have referred them to General William B. Taylor-Farrell. Tell Smith, his brother in the Navy, that no charming women have insisted on taking charge of me, as they are always doing of him. I am left to my own recourses. Now, here's what's done in the Congress.
Okay. The letter we just read is written a day before John Brown's hung, because he was captured and sentenced to death for insurrection. Okay.
Yep. Now, this is what the Committee of Congress found and investigates the matter. Who reported that the invasion was an act of lawless ruffians under the sanction of no public or political authority, distinguished from ordinary violence only by the ulterior ends in contemplation by them, and by the fact that the money to maintain the expedition in the large amounts they had brought with them had been contributed by other states of the Union. Virginia, not knowing the extent of the insurrection, was preparing for a war. Henry A. Wise, then governor, promptly took active measures to preserve the peace of his state. And everywhere volunteers tendered their service. When Colonel Lee was ordered to Harper's Ferry, and Jeb Stuart, a young lieutenant of the 1st Cavalry, was in Washington on leave of absence, happened to be at Arlington on that day, fond of enterprise and indifferent to danger, he at once volunteered as aide-de-camp to Lee, asked and received permission to accompany him, and was the first to recognize Brown, having seen him in Kansas. Afterward, he became the great cavalry chieftain of the army Lee commanded. The prisoners at Harper Ferry once turned over to the United States District Attorney, Mr. Robert Ould, and Lee returned to Washington and Arlington. In a short time was again on his way to resume his official duties in Texas. We find him writing from San Antonio, Texas, June 25, 1860, to Mrs. Lee. His impressions of one of the holidays there. Yesterday, he says, was St. John's Day, and the principal, or at least visible means of adoration and worship seemed to consist in riding horses, So every Mexican, and indeed others who could procure a quadruped, were cavorting through the streets. The thermometer over 100 degrees in the shade, and scorching sun and dust several inches thick. You can imagine the state of the atmosphere and suffering of the horses, if not the pleasure of the riders, as everything of the horse tribe had to be brought into requisition to accommodate the bipeds, unbroken colts, and worn-out hacks were saddled for the occasion. The plunging, the kicking, the former procure excitement for and distress of the latter merriment to the crowd. I did not know before that St. John set so high a value upon equitation. There he remained until summoned to Washington in February 1861, reaching that city on the 1st of March once more, and for the last time he was with his family under the roof of stately old Arlington.
Yeah, so that he's speaking of the feast of St. John the Baptist's birth, which is celebrated at the end of June. And it was probably considered a patron of the knights or of cavalrymen, and that's why they celebrate his festival that day. A bit mocking there about the Catholic festival. San Antonio was a Catholic city in 1860. So that brings his life up on how in February 61, he goes back to Virginia precisely because the secession has begun and the Civil War is ready to break out. So this completes the career of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee as of February 1861, to give you some background on what his life was and what led him to be where he was. And thank you, AJ, for having me on for this program. As one part of this series we're doing on famous Americans, whether they're Catholic or not, in U.S. history, to help you understand in depth a lot more than what you're taught in school or what you'd ever hear in a documentary, and to understand where America came from and what times were like back in the old days, as you say. So thank you for having me on, AJ, for Order Militaris Radio. It's always a pleasure.
Yep. And if you like these programs, please go to ordo-militaris.net and click on any of the show pages, and please make either a one-time or a monthly subscription so we can get better and new equipment, do even better shows for you, and even hopefully one day to have our own servers to do our own 24-hour shows with different hosts all around US and even in Europe and elsewhere. And this is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.